So I wanted to do something a little different today. Look, this is a Seattle Mariner channel, and most of the time we are just talking about the Mariners. I would say 99.9% of our talks have been about the Mariners. Some, division preview stuff and stuff like that where we talked about other teams, but always baseball. We're going to do something a little different today. And it's because, look, I'm staring outside right now. It is absolutely a miserable Seattle day, which is, a typical Seattle day in the winter. I love it. Not for everybody, but I love it. But I am on such a high from that Sugar Bowl, that Husky win, that unbelievable performance from that team. And I was thinking to myself, where does that win rank in terms of Seattle sports history? So I thought, hey, let's record a video. Let's talk about the 10 greatest wins in Seattle sports history. I have some caveats, but first, let me thank Simply Seattle for sponsoring the show, the very best in Seattle sports gear for all the teams we're going to be talking about here: Huskies, Cougars, Sonics, Storm, Mariners, Seahawks, Kraken. You can find it all at Simply Seattle. Forgot about the Sounders. You can definitely find the Sounders too. Use code MOLLYWOP15 at checkout to save 15% off your order. MOLLYWHOP15 automatically takes 15% off. It's an awesome deal. Link in the description. Thank you so much, Simply Seattle. All right, let me give you the caveats. Number one, I had to be alive for it. So the Sonics championship, which would obviously rank very high on here, doesn't count. Many Rose Bowl wins for the Huskies that could have been considered here don't count. I have to be alive for it. Sorry. Number two, Seattle only. So Washington State Cougars, Gonzaga Bulldogs, you guys don't count. You guys have had some amazing moments, especially Gonzaga, if we're just being honest. But you don't count. And number three, there's a ton of recency bias on here, and I'm going by how I felt after the win. Objectively, the biggest wins are championships. So that's how this list would go. Like, you win a championship, it's the biggest. Win a division, it's the biggest. Everything here is playoff related, I will say that. But that's not how I did the list. I'm going by how I felt after that win. Okay, those caveats aside, let me give you some games that I considered but just missed the list. The first Storm Championship. I am a huge basketball fan. We'll talk about that later. Women's college basketball and the WNBA are sports that I watch frequently. I just couldn't think of a championship win that belonged on this list. In part because I don't think that it's fair to just say that they were supposed to win, but they kind of were. They were just so good. And by the way, Sue Bird and Lauren Jackson are two of the greatest Seattle sports stars ever. It's not even close. They absolutely belong in the consideration for a Rushmore. Lauren Jackson was just stupid good. As good as Breanna Stewart is, Lauren Jackson, probably the greatest. Maybe the greatest even Seattle basketball player of all time. There, I said it. The Pac-12 championship game versus Arizona, I really wanted to include this, and it was number 11. Cold-blooded. I love Gus Johnson, by the way. That three from Isaiah Thomas, I mean, what a time. What a time to be a fan of that team. You'd have a pretty nice little NCAA tournament run after, but that shot, that's certainly one of the greatest last-second wins in Seattle sports history. Maybe the greatest. Well, second greatest. We'll talk about it. I considered all three of the Oregon games of the recent time, especially the Pac-12 championship game recently. I also considered the win over Colorado to get into the playoff as well. Just so many good things here. And I probably should have a win over Oregon on this list just because it's such a heated rival. I would argue Oregon is the biggest rival of any Seattle sports team. But I just couldn't quite include it. The wild card win last year, especially game 2. Both wins were, great. Game 3 of the ALDS also in 2000. That was awesome. One of the greatest Seattle Mariner moments without question. Just couldn't quite make it. And then finally, the one that's probably going to be the most controversial being left off this list is the NFC Championship game in 2015. Amazing. And I cannot help but remember how great I felt after that win. It was spectacular. It was one of the most draining games ever. But look, Super Bowl 49 crushed me. I can't, I don't even like thinking about it. I don't like thinking about it. It just hurts me so bad that I can't include it on this list. In if we're just being of the moment, sure, probably a top 5 win. But I can't put it on there because it crushed me. So many great things. That throw from Wilson to Curse, absolute perfection after Curse had a horrific football game, but getting that touchdown had to feel unbelievable. Curse, by the way, one has some of the greatest moments in Seattle sports history, like without question. But I can't do it. It just hurts me too much. It hurts me too much. All right, number 10, the Seahawks NFC Championship in 2005. I will tell you that I flipped 10 and 9 a whole bunch, by the way. Some of this has to do with the fact that Super Bowl 40 also crushed me. The worst officiated game I've ever seen. People talk about officiating a lot and how everybody's been screwed by the refs before. Everybody's had bad things happen to them by the refs. Seattle sports history is just chock full of them. Instant replay only exists because of what happened to the Seahawks against the Jets when Vinny Testaverde scored a touchdown from, or I think he was down at about the half-yard line. The next year, instant replay came. And that officiating in Super Bowl 40 was just atrocious. I don't think it was fixed. I just think they're not very good at their jobs. However, it was a massive win. The first time that the Seahawks are going to the Super Bowl. And, Sean Alexander, one of the most underrated Seattle sports stars. Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson obviously help a lot. Matt Hasselbeck was a very solid quarterback. But you have to also remember that the Seahawks, and this is one of the reasons why we'll talk about it in number 7. It's very similar for the Sonics, but they took so long to break through, and there were so many heartbreaking plays. We want the ball, and we're going to score. Okay. Then that next year, Bobby Ingram, one of the most reliable receivers in Seahawk history, flat out drops a pass that would have won the game against the Rams. The last Seahawk game, by the way, that I was at was that game. It's been a while. But they finally break through, and they get the chance to go play for a championship. For the first time in my life, a professional sports team is going to be playing a winner-take-all game. I was so excited. So excited. Sucks how it ended, but that win over the Panthers, and it was such a dominant win. Might put it down the list a little bit just because, they were clearly the best team on that day. They shut down Steve Smith, who was just having an unbelievable postseason run. But unfortunately, it ends poorly, but I remember it quite fondly. Number 9, the first MLS championship, the shootout win against the Toronto FC. The Toronto FC. That's not a thing. Wasn't a great game until the end, but finally breaking through again, you know, finally after, so many years of being one of, if not the best teams in the regular season, you finally get that championship. In a year where they weren't great, I think they were the 3rd best team in the Western Conference. They're good. They weren't great. This one goes high on the list for a lot of reasons. One, I can perfectly remember where I was just on pins and needles watching that game. And 2, that save off Altidore by Stephen Fry in extra time. Perfection. One of the great moments in Seattle sports history. Has to be on here. Finally getting that championship. And I know they've won a couple after. But that doesn't take away from that win whatsoever. Has to be on this list. Flipped 9 and 10 a lot, just being honest with you. But that save and then winning, and I'll tell you this too. I think shootouts are a terrible way to end a sporting event. I know they're probably a necessary evil, but they are an evil. A free throw contest to end a sporting event is stupid. I think they're awful, but Stephon Fry making a couple big saves in that as well. Hmm, that was fun. That was really fun. And number 8, it's the Kraken winning game 7 last year against the Avalanche. In terms of what the game actually meant, it's probably behind only one or tied with one, I guess, in terms of like what it actually meant. It's a win in the first round. Like we will probably look back on this one and not think a whole heck of a lot about it. But I will think about it a lot because it cemented the Kraken as being one of my favorite things. They were already one of my favorite things because I love hockey, love the uniforms. www.simplyseattle.com. But that win, it just I was I was elated. I was elated, and it was such a complete win for a team that didn't have stars and still doesn't. Some really good players, and I think Matty Beniers can be a star someday. Some really good players, but not that big star, and you're facing the defending Stanley Cup champions. It's such a team effort. Grubauer was fantastic. By the way, Grubauer cannot be the starting goalie when he comes back. Joey Decord. Yesterday was so fun. That Winter Classic and then the Sugar Bowl. But that was such a complete team win over the defending champion. No analyst picked the Kraken to even come close that I saw. Saw a lot of Avalanche in 4, Avalanche in 5. And I get it. I totally get it. The Avalanche were the better hockey team by a lot in terms of talent. In terms of results the previous year, they won the Stanley Cup. But they did it. They played perfect team hockey. And I know that can be a real cliche in every sport, but they played perfect team hockey and they get the job done. That was awesome. It was an amazing, amazing moment that I will remember for a long time. Number 7, the Sonics beat the Jazz in game 7. This was 95-96. Like I said, basketball, huge fan, and probably my favorite sport growing up, and helped a lot by the fact that the Sonics were so good. The thing you have to remember here, too, is the worst loss in Seattle sports history, if it's not Super Bowl 49, it is game 5 of the 93-94 playoffs. I don't even like thinking about it. When I see Dikembe Mutombo holding that basketball with the smile, I don't want to call it PTSD because I think that's silly, but I do get triggered. I do get triggered. It just absolutely crushes me. And you got to remember the year before that, they get to game 7 of the Western Conference Finals, and I still think that game was fixed. 64 free throws is how many free throws the Suns took in that game. So you lose that heartbreaker to set up Jordan versus Barkley. Let's be honest, the NBA wanted it. Then you lose in 5 to Denver. You lose in 4 to the Lakers. And in the first round of that series, Kings win game 2, and it's 1-1. And I'm thinking, uh-oh, maybe they're just not built for the postseason. Maybe this is just something that can't happen. But they win the next 2 of that. They sweep the Rockets, and the Rockets were such a good team then, too. Back-to-back NBA champions. And then they faced the Jazz, and I hated the Jazz. Hated them. Respected them as basketball players, but I hated them. Hated Jerry Sloan, fantastic coach, but hated him. Hated Karl Malone. Hate Karl Malone even more now. Hated John Stockton. Hate John Stockton even more now. Kind of like Jeff Hornacek. Greg Ostertag and Antoine Carr were funny. But I loathed them. But they were so good. Such a good basketball team, and that was such a great series. In game 7 with Peyton and Kemp and Schrempf, Big Smooth, Hersey Hawkins, they get it. And that was the first time a team that I rooted for got to play in a championship series. That was amazing. And I knew they had no shot against the Bulls, even as a 12-year-old, 13, 13. I knew they had no shot. That's the greatest sports team ever put together. Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, Kukoc, whole bunch of great role players. It's the best NBA team ever. I knew they had no shot. And it was amazing they got to 6. And, there's a lot of rumors that the reason it got to 6 was because, maybe they wanted to clinch it home because they didn't look like they were playing very hard in game 4 or game 5, to be honest with you. But I don't care. They took that team to 6, but getting to that championship game after the absolute crap that was the postseason the previous 3 years, man, that was amazing. And number 6 is the Sugar Bowl. And you can call this recency bias if you'd like, but I'm putting it up there. Fantastic game. Ending just about killed me. Real quick, just my personal thoughts. I have no problem with what DeBoer was doing there. Go get the first down, win the game. If they only had one timeout left, sure, I would then, completely change what I was doing. But they had 2. Make them use those timeouts. Go get a first down, win the game. The unbelievable bad luck of that injury. And I don't think that's process over result stuff. I think that was sound process. Worked really well against Oregon in the championship game too, in the Pac-12 championship game. But it was such an amazing win against a really good Texas team. Michael Penix is the greatest Washington Husky of all time. All due respect to Steve Ettman. The accuracy he had on his throws and the zip and the timing. I'd love to see him be a Seattle Seahawk, by the way. Love it. But it was phenomenal. It was such a tense game. They were absolutely deserving to be there. A lot of people were complaining that they were playing in the Sugar Bowl instead of the Rose Bowl. I don't think people are complaining too much anymore. Oh, man. I mean, just some of those throws and, some big defensive plays too. Getting those turnovers, opportunistic. And now you get a chance to play Michigan for a championship, which is kind of fitting. We'll talk about it in just one sec, but that's number 6 for me. Number 5 is the Mariner 1-game playoff. Look, 95 is a magical Seattle Mariner year. One we probably have too much nostalgia and hagiography for, but it is what it is. But none of the amazing moments, and in particular one amazing moment, can happen without winning that 1-game playoff. I think people sometimes forget, I certainly forget it, that the Mariners lost their last 2 games with a chance to clinch that division and not play that game. But it felt, even losing those 2 games, it did feel like they were just going to win this game, in part because Randall K. Johnson was on the mound and he pitched a fantastic baseball game. And Mark Langston wasn't great. He was good for the first few innings and then, lost his command. A play JT Snow makes probably 95 times out of 100, if not 99 times out of 100. Goes under his glove. Everybody scores. I talked about it in the greatest hits in Seattle Mariner history. But none of and we'll talk about it, none of those amazing moments happen. And the Seattle Mariners probably aren't here without that win. The Seattle Mariners are probably on their way to Tampa Bay, if not for that victory. And so that's why it has to be there. Randy looks to the sky. 14 strikeouts. Stupid Tony Phillips breaking up the shutout. That was an amazing game. I talked about this in the greatest hits thing. My Mom and dad let me stay home, come home early from school to watch that game. For whatever reason, it was on in the afternoon. And oh, I was just, uh, what a good time. What a good time. Number four, the Rose Bowl win over Michigan in 1991. This would probably be higher if the Huskies didn't split the championship, but it's also one of the very first sporting events I can truly remember watching and just being enamored with how dominant that team was. That defense was just stupid good. And Steve Ettman is an all-time Husky legend. Like I said, I'd probably put him at number two on Huskies of all time. Just an absolute force, but they had great linebackers. They had an awesome secondary. They had unbelievably underrated weapons. Their quarterbacks, Billy Joe Hobart is obviously somewhat of a leper in Husky history, but pretty darn good quarterback. And Mark Brunell was awesome too. And just the domination. I mean, seeing that Heisman pose, and Desmond Howard was a terrific college player, but seeing that Heisman pose after that touchdown, just brings a smile to my face. And I just remember watching that game with my family and being like, yeah, sports are pretty cool. Sports are pretty cool. And then that same year, that 91 World Series hooked me for baseball. Um, that Christian Leitner shot in 92, the year later. I mean, had some pretty fun, weird, the formative moments you remember. But just that complete, and 34-14, which I believe was the final score, doesn't even come close to telling you how dominant Washington was in that game. And I have very little doubt Washington would have beaten Miami. Very little. Unfortunately, because it's a split championship, I rank it below a few others, but definitely in the conversation for the top three, top two, even sporting events, even though I have it at number four. At number three, and it may surprise you, I have Super Bowl 48. And you may be wondering, what the heck is ahead of this? It's huge. The first undisputed championship of my life is that game. But there's two I have ahead of it. I don't think you can completely ignore the fact that it was a blowout. And that's great. It shows you how great that team was. The best defense that any of us will ever see from a Seattle sports team, the best unit. Seattle's got some great starting pitching, and the Huskies have a really good offense. And, we've seen some really good stuff. That Mariner offense in 97, so good. So good. But it ain't the LOB, and it ain't those pass rushers, and it ain't those linebackers. I mean, you're talking about several Hall of Fame talents. Same for the 97 Mariners, You have A-Rod, Griffey, Edgar, and Buhner hitting in a row. And in particular, those first three. That's great. It ain't the LOB. The best secondary I've ever seen. Going up against one of the greatest offenses in modern sports history. And they dominated them. But I look back at that game and I watch it a lot. I do. It's on NFL Network all the time, and I watch it considerably. And I watch, the Steve Rabel highlights and all that stuff. It just doesn't hit me the way these other two do. Objectively, the greatest win in Seattle sports history. The most important win in Seattle sports history. Objectively. Since I've been alive. But it doesn't quite match the nostalgia And let's be honest, this is a nostalgia list of these next two. Number two is game five of the ALDS in 1995. Do I really need to go over it? I'm not going to tell the whole dad story again because I'm not going to cry in this video. But it's if the one game playoff didn't save baseball in Seattle, that game certainly did. And lying down the left field line, watching Junior run around those bases. And it was a terrific game before that, too. The Doug Strange walk, Joey Cora hitting a homer, Griffey hitting a homer. It was a spectacular game that ended as perfectly as possible. You know, it would have meant something too if it was Shane Monahan, who didn't play on that team, obviously, and Greg Perkle scoring those two runs. It would have meant something. But Joey Cora, who was an immensely popular Seattle Mariner, and Ken Griffey Jr. coming around. How can you not have it in the top two? You could argue it's number one because of the fact that it maybe literally saved baseball in Seattle. Do you think, and you can comment on this if you'd like, comment on anything you want. Please hit like and subscribe. Do you think Seattle gets a Major League Baseball team if they leave? I don't know. I don't know. The argument is that Tampa Bay doesn't get a team, right? But maybe they go somewhere else. I don't know where, but maybe because they were going to expand to 30. That was happening. But maybe it's not Seattle. Anyway, let's not think about that. Number one, the NFC Championship game against the San Francisco 49ers. Some of this is the fact that it's an unbelievable football game. Obviously, it is. Some of this is, I think, the most clutch play in Seattle sports history. Elijah Jackson might have something to say about that. By the way, for Elijah Jackson to make that play, I should have talked about that when we were talking about the Sugar Bowl. But for a guy who has been basically roasted online all year, for him to make that play, oh, unbelievable. Unbelievable. Anyway, the Richard Sherman tip is, to me, the greatest play in Seattle sports history. I'm not 1,000% sure he meant to tip it to Malcolm Smith, but I've seen them do it before, so I certainly think it's very possible, if not likely. It doesn't matter. It was a terrific play, and good for Malcolm Smith for making the catch. That was just an unbelievable football game. Russ made some huge throws. That 4th and 7 touchdown on the offsides play to Jermaine Kearse, by the way. The defense was spectacular in the second half, even while Colin Kaepernick was making some unbelievable athletic plays. But I will remember this one a little bit. Gosh dang it. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. That game happened about 2 weeks after my grandpa died. And I watched it with my grandma. And my grandpa was not a huge Seattle Seahawks fan. Like, he watched him, he rooted for him. Funny story I can tell you about the one game I went to with my grandpa someday, but it was very cold that day. Let's just say that. And if not for the kindness of a stranger, we would have been out of there. Anyway, that's a long story. But watching that game with my grandma and just like, yeah. Yeah, sports are pretty great. And my grandma's not the biggest NFL fan either, or football fan. But we watched that game and the high, the absolute high of that game. And it sets up that Super Bowl win. I have it at number one. I think you can argue any of those three, and maybe the Rose Bowl win over Michigan for the championship deserves in that conversation. But I have it for number one. And I will be honest with you. If the Huskies beat Michigan on Monday, and I sure hope they do, I think it's going to be in the top three for sure. Some of it will depend on how it goes, but you can make the argument that it'll be number one. Going to depend on like if they win 45 3-8 like they did against like the Seahawks did against Denver. Yeah, maybe not. I don't think that's going to happen. If they win a 10-9 slugfest because the stadium in Houston leaks or something like that, or it's 21-19 with 7 field goals for Grady Gross. Maybe not. But if they win their typical thriller to win a national championship with this team, might be number one. So what do you think? Where did I screw this up? And honestly, I care. I want to know your thoughts, but I am very confident in this list for how it feels for me. What would you have number one? What miss that you would like to discuss? What's your favorite kind of mustard? Tell me it all. Please hit like, please hit subscribe. Thanks for watching this. Half an hour, not as long as I thought it would be, but this was fun. Go Huskies. Mariners, give me a reason to talk about you again. And a very happy new year to you all.